Thank you for inviting me to give this lecture. I will talk about optical properties of light and thalli in relation to UV radiation. Now I will mainly talk about UV screening in the upper lichen cortex. The upper lichen cortex, it contains secondary compounds that may absorb UV. We'll also talk about if secondary compounds really are necessary for UV screening, and that UVB may induce secondary compounds in lichens. The screening efficiency depends on hydration level. And measurement of UV screening I will also discuss somewhat. Many secondary lichen compounds absorb UVB radiation. Here I have some examples. I have yellow compound perietine in Sanctoria aureola, Sanctoria perietina. Perietine it absorbs blue light, it absorbs some UVA and also UVB efficiently. You also have the absorbance of two colorless or almost colorless secondary compounds, usnic acid and atranorine. Atranorine and usnic acid, they absorb almost no visible light, but they absorb some UVA and they absorb UVB efficiently. These secondary compounds, they are mainly situated as crystal outside lichen hypha. That has some implications for screening efficiency, because screening efficiency depends on if the compound is in solution or in crystal state. In this small experiment here, we dissolved usnic acid in ethanol and showed that the amount that is normally found in lichens very efficiently absorb all UV radiation. But if we distributed the same amount of usnic acid as a layer of crystals on a plate, then the transmittance was much higher. So it's not obvious that the amount of secondary compounds may efficiently absorb UV when they are in crystal form. For studying the effects of secondary compounds, we used a technique that we found 20 years ago that we called the acetone rinsing method. Then we found that dry lichen thallus can be put into 100% acetone for some minutes or even hours. Then most of the lichen secondary compounds can be removed. You see an example here with Sanctoria aureola before extraction and after extraction. You see that almost all perietine is removed. But this has no adverse effect on the lichen. It has the same photosynthetic efficiency afterwards. So we can just take it up, let the acetone evaporate, moisten it, and that has a normal photosynthesis. With this technique, then we showed that perietine was dependent on UVB for induction. We removed perietine from Sanctoria aureola. We exposed these lichens in the wet state to solar radiation, either with UV or with UV excluded. And then parietin was only resynthesized in the thalli that received UV. Without UV, there was no resynthesis of parietin. Also, brown melanic pigments in Lobaria pulmonaria are induced by UV. If we take Lobaria pulmonaria thalli from a shade site, then they are pale. If we place these thalli in highlight, either with natural solar radiation with UV or with solar UV excluded, then we'll see that they get this brown melanic color only when they have been exposed to UV. Hydration may be quite important for cortical transmission of light. The reason for this is probably that in a dry thallus, then there is much more reflectance between hypha in the upper cortex, whereas when the upper cortex is filled with water, then reflections are reduced and transmission of light is increased. In the visible region, then hydrated thalli, then the upper cortex transmit more than 50% of the visible light, whereas dry thalli, then only about 20% of the visible light is transmitted. This is, of course, important for photosynthesis because visible light is necessary for photosynthesis. Whereas in the dry state, then reduced transmission of visible light will protect against photoinhibition. However, for UV, and especially for UVB, then there is a very low transmission of UVB, both in the dry and in the wet state. So the photobiont is then very well protected against UVB, both in the dry and wet state. In the dry state, this protection against UVB is almost complete because you see that below 330 nanometer is almost no transmission of UV through the upper cortex. And this may be the reason, this very high protection against UVB may be the reason that lichens may survive outer space conditions for up to several weeks. We've done a couple of experiments in which we have studied the effect of removing the cortex so we can expose the algal layer directly to UV. In this case, with Lobaria pulmonaria, it was most easy to remove the lower cortex and medulla, turn the thallus upside down, and expose the photobiont layer from below. If we did that, and we measure the photosystem 2 efficiency as a proxy for damage, then it was no effect on photosystem 2 efficiency for the intact thalli when they were exposed to a high level of UV. But the exposed photobiont layer, their photosystem 2 efficiency was highly reduced when exposed to UV. On the other hand, if the same intact thalli are exposed to high visible light for the same time, then photosystem 2 is highly reduced. So there is no decrease in FVRFM, photosystem 2 efficiency, when the thalli are exposed to very high UVB, but it may be highly reduced, at least for shade-tolerant lichens, when they are exposed to high visible light. In another experiment with Nephrom arcticum and Umbilicarias podocoa, there we exposed either intact lichens without upper cortex, or isolated photobionts. It was Coccomixa in Nephroma and Trabuxia in Umbilicaria. Exposed them to UVB for 4 hours. We measured photosystem 2 efficiency during these 4 hours. For the intact thalli, as in a way expected, it was no decrease in FVRFM. The exposed photobiont layer, it was some decrease in FVRFM, whereas isolated photobionts, photosystem 2 efficiency was highly reduced. For estimating the screening efficiency of UV, we used a special technique that's called a fluorescence excitation ratio technique. It's quite complicated, so I don't have time to explain it now, but you can read more about it in this paper here. There, by this technique, we found that the isolated photobionts, Trabuxia and Coccomixa, had almost no UV screening, whereas the intact thalli had a very high UV screening. So, is maximal PS2 efficiency a good method to assess adverse effects on UVB? Can there be other adverse effects of UVB than reduced PS2 efficiency? We have found that growth, relative growth rate, RGR, can be measured quite accurately during a period as short as, for example, 2 weeks. Growth is probably a better way to measure effects of environmental factors, because growth measures the total effect on the whole lichen thallus, not only the photobiont. In experiment with Lobaria pulmonaria and Cetraria icelandica, we exposed these lichens to UVB 6 hours a day for 14 days. As in several experiments before, it was no effect of UV on photosystem 2 efficiency, whereas growth was reduced. So the thalli that was exposed to UV, they had a reduced relative growth rate, both Lobaria pulmonaria and Cetraria icelandica. So this result, it indicates that UV may have an adverse effect that is not detected by FVRFM measurements. So some conclusions. The photobiont in intact lichen thallus is extremely well protected against UVB radiation. And the protection is caused by cortical UV screening. The isolated photobionts themselves have almost no UV screening. Several cortical secondary compounds are induced by UV, but they may not be important for UVB protection. So the importance of secondary compounds in UV screening is unclear. There is much more evidence that these compounds have a function in visible light screening and herbivory defense. The explanation for reduced growth may be UV effects on the fungal partner, but more experiments are here needed. Chlorophyll fluorescence may not be a good method for estimating negative effects of UV on lichens. I will especially thank Professor Ingvar Gausler for cooperation and discussions during many years. I will also thank these other people for discussions and for providing data. So, thank you for your attention.